ELI5. Why is it that countries like Singapore and Japan do not have as bad of a drug issue, but Canada and USA it appears to be getting worse? Singapore kills drug dealers. At least that is what I was told by the manager of a group of folks I'd flown to Kuala Lumpur to teach. This was shortly after that American kid who spray-painted crap in Singapore was caned and sent back to America, and we had a short discussion about crime and punishment. She said, "I don't understand you. In Singapore, if somebody is caught selling drugs we execute them, no question." As I was in a foreign country and she was the one approving my travel and expenses, I opted to not get too far into that discussion. Over the past few decades, there has been a $50 billion year illegal arms, human trafficking, and drug smuggling industry in the Americas, with cash flowing south to cartels and drugs violence vice flowing north. The outcome is a lot of desperate, miserable people and predatory gangs exploiting them. Nowadays, the drugs may change, the sources may change, but the sick culture of violence and greed has remained and proliferates. Many thought some of these would be alleviated by legal weed, but that hasn't seemed to improve the situation in any major way. It's mostly social conventions. Drug users get shunned more there than here. There's none of the cool rebel factor in starting drugs early, as their societies mostly hate any individual that sticks or stands out. Out there, the only way to be cool is to conform. The harsh penalties are the more visible part, but it's got negligible effects. Dealers and other carrier criminals always believe they're above the law and will never get caught. Multiple studies and comparison analysis prove that harsh legal penalties do not reduce crime, because they actually punish drug users. Singapore will even execute those trafficking and selling drugs. The West is too soft and continues to soften the stance on drugs. If Western countries would execute those caught manufacturing and or selling drugs, I can guarantee drug use would plummet. Finding people, imprisoning them for a few years, forcing them to drug treatment programs or community service clearly isn't working. Real punishment for those selling and using will absolutely bring down drug use consequences. In America, our southern border, which is wide open right now, allows for people and goods to come in unchecked. A lot of those goods are drugs. In the West Coast, the big cities will fund your drug habits by handing out paraphernalia and no repercussions for using in the public, which is why you see zombies in places like SF, LA, Portland, Seattle. Drug addicts aren't given proper help. They're just enabled to continue using by the state. Japan and Singapore don't play that way. This sounds like a very incomplete question to me, even a leading question. The Netherlands and Portugal have decriminalized many drugs. How do the drug issues in these countries compare to those in Canada and the USA? Many states inside the United States have decriminalized cannabis, and a few are looking to decriminalize psilocybin as well. How do the drug issues in the states which have pursued decriminalization compare to those in states which have not? I wonder if looking at underlying issues might be useful, such as why do people feel the need to take drugs? What societal issues exist that cause personal distress, fatalism? What are the levels of absolute poverty? What age group is most affected by drug use? What does society overall think about all kinds of drug use, including prescription? Are there treatment plans readily available for drug use? Are drugs constantly advertised on TV? It's all about incentives, my man. If in the US or Canada they made a new law that says anyone who uses drugs, or anyone who sold those drugs gets mandatory death penalty, I bet many drug users and dealers would decide no amount of money, or high, is worth potentially getting the death penalty for, and then they'd stop. X200B. Are the US or Canada going to do that? No, probably not. Would be seen as too extreme, of course. I know you are insinuating that America should have harsher drug laws like those countries. But the Singapore model is a horrible idea for human rights. You really think the lesson of the drug war is that America should imprison more people for smoking pot? A better question would be, why can't America be like progressive European countries which have a higher quality of life without criminalizing half the population? They're islands, so it's much easier to control their borders. The USA and Canada have huge wide open borders that are much harder to control. You can't just walk over the border to Japan. In addition to that, the govs of Japan and Singapore actually care about enforcing immigration law and drug law, and USA and Canada don't really care. It's not nearly as much of a priority to know what's coming over their borders. It's instant death row for 15 grams of heroin. Different drugs have different penalties, but it's very strict. Drug trafficking gets you very long jail sentence and canning or death row if you exceed a limit which is very very small. Borders control have puffer machine, you can't hide any drugs too. To summarize, if you get caught drug trafficking, you're most likely going to end up death row and waiting to be hanged. I would argue that part of the reason is that Singapore and Japan are mostly ethically homogeneous places where demographics that would be affected by systemic racism are much smaller. Furthermore, these countries are culturally very different with very different ideas about how to be a part of a society. Western North American countries are far more self-indulgent and self-important culturally. Draconian punishment. Both are pissant countries in comparison. Very small. Japan doesn't have a land border, so smuggling and stuff is harder, and its majority elder population is very socially conservative when it comes to recreational drugs, which means they're all bad. Singapore is more like a city-state like Hong Kong. It would be more accurate to compare it to just one large US city. Biggest drug dealers in the States is Big Pharma. Probably worth checking your bias for the types of drugs you're referring to. USA has a huge opioid crisis. Other countries just aren't going through that. It's a North America thing. USA is the king of war on drugs. The war on drugs has failed. People do drugs everywhere. Americans are just turbo capitalists at it because those countries don't allow or promote drug use, even in a safe manner. Drug laws are very harsh in these countries. If you get caught trafficking 500 grams of marijuana in Singapore, you can face the death penalty. X200B. Those countries are very clean, safe, and they understand their values, and are not afraid to guide society as strongly as necessary. Worth adding that life is generally easier in many ways, not so in others, so people turn to narcotics less. Universal healthcare or very cheap healthcare means people can afford to seek medical attention to get pain managed properly without turning to street drugs. Cheaper mental health services. Lower economic inequality. Lower rates of homelessness. I was snowboarding in China and a guy was lighting up a joint while we were far off the trail. Just shooting the shit. I asked him what the law is like about weed there. He said something along the lines of, "Oh, you know, same as heroin." When I asked what that meant, he clarified that you'll pretty much go to prison forever. I said no thanks to the joint. There is a huge difference between a good county and a bad one like the US. Most countries care about their people and adapt to them. When you live in hell, you need more vices. So drugs make more sense in the US. Grew up in the US and have lived in over a dozen countries now. US is still hands down the worst place I've ever lived. Singapore hangs drug smugglers, yes, hang, and you can get significant jail time for use. You don't want to mess with those things here. I live in Singapore. Japan, behind the scenes, has a third world country prison system with subhuman conditions and long arrest time, years before even making it to trial. Bottom line, harsh laws, social condemnation and harsh sentences. I remember in the news back in the 90s an American teen was caught vandalizing. His sentence was something like 40 lashes. It was all over American news. Our government asked for him to be returned to face punishment here. Singapore gave him his punishment, then shipped him home. Well, for one, the governments in Japan and Singapore didn't push crack on their population for a decade to fund illegal wars. On top of harsh laws for drug import, social inequality is much lower in both places, which doesn't create an underclass without access to education, jobs or healthcare that then moves to drugs. Singapore, extremely harsh punishment. Japan has an extremely high conviction rate. They catch you doing something illegal, they will coerce you into admitting you did it, else you're stuck waiting until you do. Justice works differently there. Plus it's an island. I suppose it's tougher to smuggle things in. They execute people for drug use in Singapore. Citizens, visitors, all are put to death. Fun fact: no one seems to want to admit Malaysia, despite being under Sharia law, has been fighting back against capital punishment. So they quietly send prisoners over the border their neighboring countries to be killed. USA has worsening drug problems due to the fact that the US is bordering Mexico, and Mexico being the biggest drug producer in the world doesn't help. For other countries, the drugs would need to transport over ships, planes, trains and cars. Each extra mile makes it harder for the drug to get delivered. Lol, the answer is so obvious it can be hard to see. There is this idea that you can't dissuade people from crimes by being harsh with the consequences. When you lock up people hurting those around them, it removes a lot of the social problems that cause others to commit crimes. CIA and FBI. It's all public how they bring them in to sell on the streets to have off the books money. They obviously stopped doing it and will never do it again. BC they got caught. Sure, the laws have something to do with it, but Purdue Pharma is one of the main reasons we have a drug epidemic. People used to do crack, heroin, and meth more often for hard drugs. Now, the majority of addicts are turning to pills. Blame Big Pharma. It reminds me of Locked Up Abroad, specifically the Thailand and South Korea episodes. I had a friend from Canada who I met in Korea and she had smoked some weed. She said she'd never do it again because the risk was far too high for such crappy weed. In Singapore they'll hang you from meat hooks for a few days, then either execute you or imprison you for life. In Japan, it's because alcohol is plentiful and they all prefer to get drunk. In fact, to show their team spirit, their bosses insist on it. Bruh, they hang drug users in Singapore. In Asia, drug use, not even just trafficking, is often punishable by death. Thailand is seen by many as a progressive sex tourism capital, but they have very harsh penalties for drug use and possession. One theory is that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but rather human connection. Based on that theory, it may be the case that the levels of human connection are far higher in Singapore and Japan than they are in USA, Canada. It's a combination of generalized authoritarianism. Singapore is literally a dictatorship and Japan is really not that far from being one, as well as having been spared from decades of lobbying and advertising from the likes of Bayer. Everybody is forgetting the cost. Drug makers make a lot more money selling in US and Europe. Cost of living in Asia is less and people can afford expensive stuff. So these cartels, for maximum profit, sell in Europe and US. Basically getting caught means jail for years. Imagine you did weed a year ago and a year later there's proof that you did. The police can persecute you even if it has been a year since you did it and you can still go to jail.